This is section 7, lecture 4. We are still talking about foreign policy bureaucracies, and in this lecture we're going to be discussing the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense. The Department of Homeland Security was created in 2003 in the wake of the September 11th, 2001 attacks and the criticisms of the United States government after those attacks. Among those criticisms were that our bureaucracies didn't necessarily coordinate or communicate with one another. They didn't share their information. And so what the Department of Homeland Security does is to create an umbrella organization for several former independent executive level agencies. And we have a list of these below. Transportation Security Administration, TSA, your friends from the airport. Customs and Border Protection, Citizenship and Immigration, Immigration Customs Enforcement, also called ICE, U.S. Secret Service, which was formerly under the Department of the Treasury, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the U.S. Coast Guard, which was formerly under the Department of Defense, U.S. Office of Cybersecurity, Communications, and National Protection and Programs, and the National Biological Warfare Defense Analysis Center. The idea was to coordinate these organizations that in some instances have a bit of foreign policy necessity, that is dealing with immigration, dealing with threats from abroad, but have also a foot in domestic policy as well, because these agencies also are about domestic security too. And so then we see the structure and the agencies of the Department of Homeland Security from a figure from your textbook. The Department of Defense is the largest and oftentimes best known bureaucracy from our foreign policy bureaucracies. It falls under the divisions of the different departments of the Army, of the Navy, of the Air Force, and has several million active and reserve employees, that is active military and reserve military, but also hundreds of thousands of civilian employees as well. As we discussed earlier, it has the largest budget of any other set of bureaucracies or agencies in the U.S. government. It has the largest number of employees in the U.S. government. In fact, by some counts, it is the largest employer in the world. And so you see the numbers there for the budget. Approximately 55% of the discretionary budget, depending on the year, 18 to 20% of the total budget of the United States. And so that means approximately 19% of your tax dollar goes to the Department of Defense. Here we see a figure from your textbook that looks at the structure of the Department of Defense. As I said earlier, there's the Department of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. What we'll be talking about here is the Joint Chiefs of Staff and their duties. We'll be talking about the Office of the Secretary and its duties. But besides it being broken up into the different departments, it is also broken up into what are called combatant commands. And this is a new development, a recently new development for the Department of Defense and its organization. When it comes to planning and priorities around the world, different aspects of the Department of Defense focus on different regions. And so then when we engage around the world in different regions, there's going to be different leadership based on region, based on training, based on expertise, so on and so forth. And so you see then how the Department of Defense looks at the world and plans for the world and potential threats and potential invasions and potential military engagements. Africa Command, Central Command. Central Command is probably the best known one recently because it focuses on the Middle East, Central Asia, so on and so forth. CENTCOM, if you hear that in the media. But there's a European Command. Northern Command has to do with the Northern Hemisphere. The Northern Hemisphere of the Western Hemisphere, that is North America. PAC Command, the Pacific. Southern Command is South and Central America. Special Operations, Strategic, and Transportation Commands all go in together as support organizations. When it comes to foreign policy influence and foreign policy development, the key influence from the military is shown through the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And these are the leaders of all the different services. Their job is to provide guidance and advice to the Secretary of Defense, but also to the President. And the chair of the Joint Chief of Staff serves on the National Security Council, and oftentimes so do some of these other Joint Chiefs. It was created as an advisory committee along with the National Security Agency and the Central Intelligence Agency in the National Security Act of 1947. Below, I have a list of current Joint Chiefs of Staff. Their names are not necessarily important because they do change from time to time. But as you see, you have a representation of the different branches: Navy, Army, Air Force, Marines. You have a representative from the National Guard, but then the chair and vice chair as well. And oftentimes they fluctuate from one service branch to another in their representation. The Joint Chiefs of Staff are there to advise the President and advise the Secretary of Defense. And sometimes this advice is very influential and sometimes it is not. And so over time there has been an issue from president to president or administration to administration of influence. And this has to do with the favor of the President of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and vice versa. Some presidents get along with the Chiefs of Staff very well. Some of them don't get along at all. Some presidents trust the Joint Chiefs. Sometimes the Joint Chiefs trust the President. And sometimes in our history that trust is not there. One of the historical areas of mistrust was between the Joint Chiefs of Staff and President Kennedy. And this led to that creation of XCOM outside of the normal chains of command that we discussed with the Cuban Missile Crisis, because there was this level of distrust between President Kennedy and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, giving him advice on how to deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so he sought out advice from other people. Another problem of influence is the Joint Chiefs of Staff commitment to their own service. This is an extension of the criticisms that we've seen with the organizational process model, where a member of a bureaucracy is going to have the priority of their own bureaucracy in mind first, rather than providing sort of a full-throated and rational piece of advice outside of that bias. And so then they may be more interested about what's good for the Army, Navy, Air Force, or Marines in providing their advice, rather than what's good for the country as a whole. We see then something that's quite influential, and this was what I mentioned earlier. The Goldwater-Nichols Act was where we saw the creation of those unified combatant commands, which gave those generals in charge of different regional planning more information, more authority, and more influence. And ultimately, the Goldwater-Nichols Act was also passed to give more influence or power to the chair of the Joint Chiefs in policy formation, sharing that power with the Secretary of Defense. One of the problems or criticisms of the Department of Defense has been with the Secretaries of Defense and their level of influence, their level of expertise, and also their political concerns for themselves and their futures, rather than necessarily representing the Department of Defense itself. And we see those criticisms play out with the office of the Secretary. Over time, there's been a variation in the power and the influence of different Secretaries of Defense. And there's been a variation in their priorities as well. One of the most influential or powerful Secretaries of Defense in recent history was Robert McNamara. And his role in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations increased the influence of the office of the Secretary of Defense by playing a key role in developing policies in nuclear issue areas. This is something that we're going to talk about in the next set of lectures, in the next section. When we talk about national security policy, McNamara's name will come up again. Those Secretaries of Defense who have been key at formulating new policies oftentimes have had larger areas of influence. Recently, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, during the Bush administration, had a larger influence or larger amount of power than previous Secretaries of Defense have had as well. Partly you could say that's because we were at war during that time, but also that has to do with his policy planning and his personality, according to a lot of accounts. When we look at the Department of Defense, we can see criticisms that oftentimes go along with those generalizations we made of the organizational process model in earlier lectures. The Department of Defense is slow to change and oftentimes slow to act. They rely on their standard operating procedures. And so they're slow to change based on the reliance of those standard operating procedures and the desire to avoid an uncertainty in developing new procedures and acting in ways that they're unsure of. They're also slow because of their size. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of planning, and a lot of time to move an army overseas. Less so than in the past, of course, with airplanes and faster ships, but still it takes time. And so the build-up to a military campaign limits when and how the military can react to certain situations. And so then, for instance, after the September 11th, 2001 attacks on the United States, President Bush wanted to go immediately into Afghanistan to fight Al-Qaeda. Well, to do so on a large scale was going to take a lot of time. And so the CIA in their clandestine operations stepped in, and were among the first people on the ground in Afghanistan, fighting against Al Qaeda rather than the military. Special forces are the area of the military that can move quickly, don't necessarily have to have a lot of support, but are still limited in number. And so then, because of the timing and the planning and the support, the coordination that it takes to invade another country, all of this takes a lot of precious time when it comes to moving the military. Another criticism is that they focus on conventional war rather than irregular war. But this is something that is changing in the wake of our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Conventional war is where armies fight armies. Irregular war is where armies fight civilian populations, insurgencies, rebellions. Oftentimes these have more staying power, lasting power, than large standing armies do, because they can blend back and forth into the civilian populations. And so then how to tackle that irregular war is something that has been new among the planning of the Department of Defense and our national security priorities, but not historically there. And this is one of the criticisms, is sort of a hangover from the Vietnam era as well. So that's something that we are going to address in our next set of lectures when we talk about national security policy. So this has been a brief understanding of the Department of Defense, but we're going to talk about their policies in a completely different section that's coming up next, section 8.